and people can filter in as they come. My name is Carrie Perkins. I am the Senior Museum Specialist for the Campbell Museum at Ainsley House, and I just want to thank you all so much for coming. Some of you are coming back for your second History Happy Hour. Some of you are here for the first time, so I really appreciate you supporting us. And tonight is a really special lecture. It's on a topic that most of us don't know enough about in terms of our American history. And Joe Yasutake, probably butchering your name, is a member of the Japanese American Museum in downtown San Jose. And I've been encouraging people to visit the museum. We've got pamphlets out front. I've been talking to the president. They've got a lot of events going on. So if you want to know more, I absolutely encourage you to visit, as well as Japantown, which is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year, which is very impressive. I will kind of shorten my speech and let Joe do most of the talking so he can let you know about the museum. And we will have time afterwards for some questions and answers. And I know that one of our members of our audience, Bob Laws, would like to share something with you as well about his history with Japanese American history. So thank you so much.
Harry, before Joe gets started, we just have a few more folks who are looking for chairs.
There are 2 chairs up here. And there's
We have
2
more
chairs
seats
back
inside.
there.
There's 2 seats.
And there's 3 chairs here.
We have
And there's
2
chairs, there's 3 over there. We've got plenty more.
2 sets of 2 and a set of 3.
I needed to. We're 3.
A 3. Come with me, 3.
And I did want to remind people to, when you have questions, to speak up so everybody can hear you.
Just walk through that way. Okay, one of you that way and 2 of you follow me. We're a little piece that's
Yeah.
You know what, if we,
It's a very informal event, so get to know your neighbors. There are chairs over on the side too as well. So, yeah.
one more over here if we have anyone.
Those are, I think they're free. Yeah. Those are free as well. Yeah. Front row. And then there's one. Yep. There's 3 back here.
You know what? I wonder if singles I see.
I don't know if any more people are actually coming. Thank you for your patience. Do you know what? You can get around this way if it's easier to come around this way. I'm so sorry. Sorry, thank you.
Okay.
Your patience and your maneuvering.
Yeah. It's very
Okay, I guess we can get started then. Kind of hard to compete with all this great food and wine and so forth. Let me get started here. My intent is to talk for maybe a couple minutes about the museum itself, as you see the photo up here. Talk a little bit about Japantown, and just to acquaint you with the area there. But spend most of my time talking about the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. And if you have any questions, as I'm talking, please just raise your hand, and we'll try to accommodate the questions as we go along. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Now, if I sit down, can you see me? Or does it matter?
no, I can hear you.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because the table here is a little bit low, and I can't reach. I don't have a remote, and I can't reach the control here. Okay, so let me start then. You see the photo here. It's an artist's rendition, actually, of the museum, the new museum, which I will talk about. The museum itself started back in 1987 in a small rented room in a building that was just 2 doors from where we are now. In the late 1990s, a pioneer farmer named Eiichi Sakaue, who was a big-time farmer in San Jose, and one of the founders of the museum, by the way, purchased the property of Dr. Ishikawa, who was just 2 doors down from the Issei Memorial Building where they were. And he donated that property to us. And it had a nice 4-bedroom, beautiful 4-bedroom home that we kind of converted into a museum. And we used that for several years for a museum to start building up our exhibits, and people were donating artifacts to us and so forth. So Very soon, we outgrew that, and we realized that we really needed to expand. Initially, we were just going to add to the building that we had, but the architects told us that it's going to cost you twice as much to do that. So we finally had to level the building that we hated to do because it was such a nice, nice brick building. But we did do that, and we got a grant from the California Cultural and Historic Endowment for $1 million on the stipulation that we raise $1 million from the community. And we were lucky enough to do that. And you can imagine, it takes a lot of $100, $200 donations to make up $1 million. But the community was very, very generous. And then we also had some help from a couple of very generous donors who provided big chunks of money for us. So with that, we finally got the new building open in October of 2010 after some pain and suffering kind of things that went on as we were constructing the building that I won't go into now. But after all that, we were able to open up the museum in October of 2010. And just as a sort of a statement of what are we about, why are we there? It's to collect and preserve and share with the community Japanese American history, culture, and arts, with emphasis, of course, on the greater Bay Area. And we do that through exhibits and various kinds of programs that we have. I might mention that the museum, as we call it JAM fondly, is operated solely by volunteers. We have no paid staff. And as Aggie in the back, who is the president now, can tell you, that causes us pain sometimes. But on the other hand, we have a fantastic number of very, very dedicated volunteers that help us keep the whole place going. We also have a board of directors and probably over 100 at this point, volunteers who come in and do all kinds of things for us. This is a photograph of the building as it exists now. The whole first floor, except for the museum store that we have, is devoted to exhibits, and then we have a community room upstairs where we can have larger meetings. These are just some shots of the inside of the building, just so you can see what the museum area looks like. This is the section where we do talk about the World War II internment, and I'll be talking more about that in a little bit. This is a replica of a camp barracks room that one of our founders, actually an amazing guy named Jimmy Yamaichi, who built this almost single-handedly, literally with hammer and nails and screws and everything else, using drawings from Tule Lake, which was one of the camps that people were in. We also have probably the only agricultural exhibit that has a lot of equipment that Japanese American farmers used as they came to California and started to get into farming. We even have like a 1927 Model T Ford that we have that still runs, by the way. All we have to do is put a battery in it and it'll go. And the gentleman you see there is the person I mentioned, Jimmy Yamaichi, who is now 92. When he built that barracks room that you saw earlier, he was a mere 87 or something. So he was just a kid, but I worry about him climbing the ladders and all that kind of thing to make that thing. We also have a nice museum store now, so which is stocked very nicely. We have a lot of public programs, and that's what keeps us going aside from the exhibits. We've had all kinds of things like the untold story of, for example, why was there not internment in Hawaii, where 2/3 of the population almost was Japanese American. And then we even had things on bullying kind of thing. We feel like the Second Ward treatment of Japanese Americans was as bullish as you can get. So we felt like that's a topic that's very appropriate for us to keep track of. Let me tell you a little bit about the Japantown community. The first immigrants from Japan arrived in the 1890s. The actual birth of Japantown in San Jose is dated at 1890. And by the year 1900, there were already over 200 permanent residents in the area. And so the Japantown area that you see now, if you come down, the Japantown area is, how many have you been to Japantown? Okay, so you're a little familiar, at least with the restaurants, probably. But between 4th and 6th Street and Taylor and Empire is what generally is talked about as Japantown. And that's the area that grew very quickly. At first, the first immigrants that came over were bachelors, young, and they took up farming. And they were very, very successful with that, by the way, as I will mention later. And so the Japantown area there kind of grew to support this group of young men who were farming, and they would come into town to the Japantown area to eat, sleep, and what have you. So they were bathhouses, gambling places, boarding houses, restaurants, and so forth that kind of grew up to support this initial population. It also helped that it was next to an area, actually a Chinatown. Yes?
So could I ask what first prompted the immigrants to come to Japan, from Japan in the 1890s?
Why did they?
Yeah, what was the trigger?
You know, there's so many different reasons. Some came because of the economic conditions, and they just, you know, they wanted to find something else. Others came to seek a fortune. You know, they heard about the great land of America and so forth. So there's just a variety of the kinds of reasons. My dad came over because he was the oldest in the family. And his father, my grandfather, owned a farm. And so he knew that as the oldest son, he was going to inherit the farm if he stayed in Japan. He did not want to be a farmer. So there were so many others that did, but he just did not want to be a farmer, so he left Japan because. So you know, there's just so many different kinds of reasons.
Thank you.
But the fact that Japantown grew and prospered, even from the very beginning, was due in great part to the fact that there was a Highlandville, which was a Chinatown. The initial Chinatown in San Jose was burnt, not Chinatown, but, well, yeah, the Chinatown area burnt down in downtown San Jose area. And there was a German immigrant named John Heinlein who took a liking to the Chinese, and he purchased a property on between 6th and 7th and Jackson and Taylor. And that whole area became a Chinatown, which they called Highlandville, after his name. And so they were prospering, unlike the two countries of Japan and China. The relationship between the people, the new people that were coming into Japantown and the ones who were in Highlandville was very good, because the Chinese merchants would give them credit, you know, when they needed to buy supplies and so forth. So there was a very nice synergistic kind of a relationship between the two communities. And that helped a lot in kind of keeping the place going and in fact growing. So during the war, of course, it became a ghost town. There was nothing left, everybody was in camp, and fortunately there was a Mr. Peckham, who was an attorney, who sort of became the godfather of Japan, of the Japantown area. He would take care of the property the people owned, and make sure that things were okay. And then as people started coming back, he just returned the properties back to these people again. So he had a great deal to do with the fact that the Japantown in San Jose survived, whereas many, many others did not. Because during that time period, the redevelopment agency would come in and just, you know, level the place and so forth. And by 1947, you know, a couple years after the war was over, there were 40 businesses again in Japantown thriving quite well. Okay, now is there anything about Japantown that you, or the museum that you would like to ask a question about? If not, I'm going to move on to the World War II experience.
I have a question.
Yes.
What is your favorite Japanese restaurant?
They're all pretty good. Yeah, they really are quite good. Most of them have been in the area for a long time, and that's because they do quite well. Yes?
I have a question. Can you tell us about the history of Fuji Tower?
Fuji Tower, well, I know a little bit about it. It's a senior center. Initially, it was built with the idea of the more elderly Japanese people could go in, but because of federal regulations and so forth, of course, they couldn't use that kind of criterion. So it's open pretty much to anybody, and it basically is a retirement home, pretty much for people who can live on their own still. Yes?
A couple of slides back, and you know, maybe I should have raised my hand then. There was a comment about, or a bullet item, about the Filipino community and the Japanese community. Could you speak to that? I mean, what is that?
Well, the area that's Japantown, from way back, has been a very multi-ethnic kind of a background. There are a lot of Italians, there are a lot of Filipinos, and so forth. So there was a relationship between the Philippines that was kind of hard to get at, by the way.
Yes.
We were trying to figure out what that history was, and it's been very hard for us to really get a handle on what that was like. And we're kind of still working on that. Okay, so what happened during the Second World War? The Second World War. Well, obviously, the first thing that happened was that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and that's what got the whole thing really, really going, and it resulted in the fact that there was a lot of fear and hysteria, like what's going to happen now? Are they coming to the West Coast? And on and on and on. And the FBI very quickly gathered up community leaders in the Japanese community, people who were Buddhist priests, language teachers, Japanese language teachers, martial arts teachers like judo and kendo, and then people that they considered to be public community leaders. And it looks like they had those people kind of identified even before the war started. For example, my father had come to this country actually when he was like 16 years old. And I don't know if you're familiar with the San Francisco area, but he went to Lowell High School in San Francisco.
Yes.
And then after he finished there, he came over when he was about 16. It took him about 4 years to get through Lowell High School. So he was like 19 when he got done, and then he went to Stanford, so he was kind of old compared to his contemporaries. But he apparently got a job as a houseboy when he first came over, who were very good to him. They sent him to school to learn English well enough that he could start going to Lowell High School. And so by the time he got to Stanford, he was fluent in English. And because of that, he was hired as an interpreter in Seattle, Washington, by the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And as a result of that job, he interviewed every single person coming from Japan through the port of Seattle. So he was very well known in the Seattle community. And so he was the president of this and the president of that, and well known in the community. So when Pearl Harbor occurred, the FBI came to our house in about 3 hours.
Oh, really?
He might have been the first Japanese to be arrested on the West Coast. I don't know about that, but it was very, very quickly. And he was not home so they sent a couple of FBI agents to a meeting that he was attending at a restaurant downtown. And ironically, they put him in a jail cell that was right upstairs from where his office was. It was in the same building that he had worked for, like 12 years or something like that. So anyway, there was a lot of that going on during that time period because there was just so much panic and concern. And President Roosevelt sent General DeWitt, a two-star general at the time, to the West Coast as a military commander to go out and assess what was going on and what should we do and things of that sort. Well, General DeWitt had his own prejudices and ideas about things. He also got a lot of input from people at certain lobbies in California. And as a result of his own feelings and other sources, one of the conclusions was that the Japanese are an enemy race, even if born in the United States, saying that even if you were born here, an American citizen, you were still an enemy. And therefore, there's potentially 100,000 enemies on the West Coast. He also got word from various factions that Japanese Americans were conducting sabotage and signaling enemy ships and things of that sort. And that was the report that was sent back to Franklin Roosevelt. And it was on that basis that President Roosevelt issued this Executive Order 9066, which in effect allowed the military commander to do whatever was necessary to make the place safe. And the implementation of that turned out to be the removal of Japanese from the West Coast. So as a result of that, there were over 110,000 people involved. And 2/3 of those people, like me, were, the citizens of the United States, born in the United States. Now, years later, it turns out that information that General DeWitt sent into Washington was not only wrong, but they also hid some other information that they also knew about. What happened was that there was a Jack and Eiko Herzig who were researchers, and they were in Washington going through all kinds of archives. They ran into this box that had never been opened before, and it said something about Japanese something or other, so they opened it to see what it was like, and it turned out to have an amazing amount of information in it. And as a result of that, they got a hold of Peter Irons, who was a professor at Harvard in the law school, who then did a lot with that information. But it turned, what was in that box was that there was a fellow named Edward Ennis, who was in, kind of middle of the road type civil servant in the government, got wind of what General DeWitt was writing up, and he felt that it really sounded strange and one-sided, and he wanted to find out a little bit more. So what he did was assign Navy intelligence and the FBI to go out to the West Coast and take a look at what was going on. So the FBI did go out, and they reported back saying that there is no evidence of anything like anybody signaling enemy ships. He also heard from the Navy intelligence team that went out, and their conclusion was that Japanese Americans are loyal and pose no threat. They both recommended against the whole issue of mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. It turns out that that whole thing had been sent in to General DeWitt, but they decided not to put it in the report. So the only thing that went in the report was what I mentioned previously. As a consequence of all that, then notices about the upcoming incarceration went up all over in areas where Japanese might congregate, communities and what have you, churches and so forth. And the notice that was sent up, in part, said, in that paragraph, it says both aliens and non-aliens will be removed from that area. Now, what's a alien?
Non-citizen.
Right. What's a non-alien? It's kind of a funny term, isn't it? It was almost invented because they didn't want to say citizen.
Right.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so they call them non-aliens. It's a real strange use of words. This is a young man putting up an evacuation sale sign in front of his store. You can imagine the government saying, in some cases, a few days, they were gonna have to get ready to move. Typically, it was several weeks, but there were people who actually were moved out in a matter of a few days. In this case, this is a fellow who owned a store, and so he had to put up what they called it in those days an evacuation sale, and they were getting pennies to $1 kind of thing, and people lost a tremendous amount of money. These are just random photos of people being moved. Packing up all the clothes. The rule was you could only take what you can carry. And so you can imagine, just think of your homes now. If somebody said, you gotta move in 5 days. And so whatever you got, get rid of it because you can't take it unless you can carry it. So I can remember my oldest, as I mentioned, my dad was picked up by the FBI, so he was gone. So that left my oldest brother, who was about 20 at the time, and my other brother, who was 18, and then my sister was about 17, with the responsibility of picking everything up, like deciding what to sell and how to sell it and all that stuff. They didn't even know I remember my sister telling me about the fact that they didn't, like my dad took care of everything apparently. And so they didn't even know that you had to pay for water, and that there was an electric bill and all that kind of thing. And we didn't, I didn't know anything about this because they shielded me from all this kind of stuff. But they didn't know where to get the money to pay the bills, and then the whole thing about the incarceration occurred, and they didn't know what are we going to sell and how much are we supposed to sell it for, and that kind of thing. Yes.
So was the entire thing administered by the military? The military? I mean, again, what I know about it, so much of it was the military administrating a lot of this stuff and overseeing the movement of peoples too.
Well, certainly in the movement, when people were actually being assembled, like here, for example. Here are a whole line of soldiers guarding these dangerous people as they were getting on the train to go off to camp, and so the military was very involved in that. I don't know that they were that involved in the process, in the sense of being responsible for helping people sell their stuff or anything like that. People were pretty much on their own in regard to that kind of thing. This is a family that's moving out. You notice they're smiling. It happens to be my family. This was a newspaper article newspaper clipping that appeared in the Seattle Times. And the original caption read, "Note smiling faces attesting to the good treatment at the camp. A lesson for Tokyo." That's, let's see. That's my sister, my oldest brother, my mother, some family friends around there, and that's me. I was 9 at the time, looking into my little shopping bag. Frankly, I don't remember what was in there except for 2 items, or 3 items actually: a baseball glove, and a Monopoly set. And I'll bet you to this day I can still tell you probably 80% of all the properties around that mug. We used to play that every day, when we were in camp, because there's not much else to do. I is anybody gonna ask me why people were smiling? My sister's a poet, and she wrote a poem about this. And the reason was that the photographer said, smile.
Oh,
You know, so what, you know, so when somebody says, hey, you smile, it's very simple. So it's not like people were necessarily happy or whatever. This is a layout of all the camps that were set up to accommodate these 110,000 people. All the camps that are along here in the open circle were what they called assembly centers. You can imagine the government suddenly are going to move 110,000 people. They had to move them someplace really very quickly. So they picked fairgrounds, racetracks, anything like that that already had buildings where they could accommodate people, while the permanent camps are being built. And the permanent camps are in solid, well, I think are in solid red diamond there. And for example, I told you I was in Seattle, Washington. We were moved to Puyallup, which was the assembly center. And then my family, my two brothers, sister, mother, and I went to Minidoka. And eventually I went down to Crystal City in Texas. But my dad at the same time was put in these Department of Justice camps, where all the people that they considered to be particularly potentially dangerous. That was in like Missoula, Montana, and Bismarck, and then eventually they all went to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then later on, my dad was able to rejoin my mother and I down in Crystal City, Texas. This is what some of the assembly centers look like. This one is at Tanfran Assembly Center. It was a racetrack. And what they did was, in some cases, move the horses out and move people in. So it was pretty dismal kind of conditions that people lived in. This is typical of the kind of buildings that were built very, very quickly, you know, like within a matter of 2, 3, 4 months, in order to accommodate the people coming out of the temporary quarters. There was a mess hall where people were going to eat 3 meals a day. Latrines and laundry areas where people did their wash and things of that sort. And then these were the barracks. There were about 5 to 6 rooms per barracks. And a family of like, in my case it was 5 people, there were 5 in our family. We had a room that was about 20 by 20 with 5 beds and so forth. Of course, there was an infamous guard tower, and then a barbed wire all the way around the camp. This was a photo of a family moving into one of the rooms, and in this case, they hadn't even finished yet. For example, there was a stove that was provided, but the stove hadn't even been installed yet. This is my family in front of our house. One of the barracks, and we had a apartment C, which was basically just one great big 20 by 20 room. And in this case, there was a soldier who was visiting, and so we were able to take this picture because he, as a soldier, was able to have a camera. Cameras were not typically allowed in the camps. I asked my sister if that was her boyfriend. She said no, but I don't know. These again, typical photos of activities in the camp for kids about my age. You know, and I was, as I mentioned, at that time I was 10, I guess. And there, even in camp, one of the routines was whether you were in school or going to some kind of an assembly or whatever, there was always a Pledge of Allegiance going on. A lot of sports. I remember initially it was just a bunch of kids getting together, but later on they kind of organized things like a Little League kind of and I can remember going from one part of the camp to the other to play other teams. People tried to kind of beautify things a little bit. They would even grow flowers and other things, trying to make things look a little bit As I mentioned, there were mess halls where people ate. You notice in this picture, you have older people and babies. What happened that a lot of sociologists talk about is that the family unit became very, very weak. Because all the teenagers and little older people went off on their own, and it left, you know, group like this. And so the family structure just kind of broke down. They did have schools. I spent the 5th and 6th grade in schools. Initially, we just sat around the floor, and eventually brought in chairs, and then brought in paper, pencil, and eventually even books. So after several months, it got to be a regular school kind of an environment. And, you know, for me, as a 10-year-old and for people my age, you know, camp was not that bad. It was just someplace where we were behind barbed wire, but then the day-to-day kind of activities we had were pretty much typical. You know, I played baseball, and I went to school, and that kind of thing. The only times I knew it was sort of the gravity of the situation was when my family thought I was sleeping at night, and they would start talking about things like what my father was doing and was he okay, and then my two brothers, my brother and sister decided they wanted to go off to college, because within about 9 months after camp got started, it must be that the government decided that this was not working out well. And so they started encouraging young people to leave, to either get a job, go to school, or join the Army, that I'll talk about in a little bit. This is my 5th grade class in Minidoka. You can see the barracks behind us. And the lady on the right there was named Miss Erickson. She was apparently she was a teacher from Detroit, Michigan. And she volunteered to come into the camp to be a teacher. She was a wonderful lady. Do any of you remember the Hardy Boy books?
Sure.
Well, she used to use that as a motivational thing. Remember at the end of each chapter something terrible was about to happen? And you had to go to the next chapter and to figure out if that did happen or not. Of course, it never did. But she used to use that to keep us in line. And I kept in touch with her for about 25 years after camp.
Oh, my goodness.
Well into my adulthood, and then I lost track of her, unfortunately. She was a great lady. This was our whole, I guess you'd call it middle school now, 5th, 6th, 7th graders. And you notice that there's several signs there for traffic control. Yeah, there are probably about a dozen trucks in the whole place, and so there wasn't a lot of traffic going on, but I think they did that to keep us busy, you know, patrol and all that. You can see the barracks behind us in the background. Now, among the, you know, each of the camps, I mentioned there were 10 camps, each of the camps had anywhere from 6,000, 7,000 to 18,000 people in them. Among all those people in those camps, there were doctors and dentists and carpenters and, you know, almost any kind of occupation you can have. So eventually, for example, this is a sign of this is a hospital. The inmates themselves, the nurses and doctors, pretty well took over. There was always a head administrator who was brought in from the outside. But the actual running of places like the hospitals were pretty much taken care of by the inmates themselves. And this is a construction crew, for example. Farming was done under very poor conditions, but the Japanese Americans were doing quite well as farmers, in particular in California. So when they got to like Montana, I can remember, in fact, this Eiichi Sako who I mentioned before we lost him several years ago, but toward the end, I used to drive into our meetings and so forth because he couldn't drive himself at night. And he used to tell me, he told me at one point that he was assigned as an assistant principal of, not principal, assistant superintendent of farming in Wyoming, the camp there, Hart Mountain. And he said that as a result of that, he got together people from the camp who were soil engineers, water irrigation people, civil engineers, and on and on and on. And they had a meeting at the very beginning. And they figured out how we're gonna get water, what are we gonna do with this soil, this dirt, basically, to fertilize it and make it grow and so forth. And they became like the second largest farming industry in Nevada, or Wyoming at the time. So they were very, very good at figuring things out and moving out. They even had livestock. And the Issei's, the first generation Japanese American, or the first generation immigrants from Japan, we call them Issei's. Like if you count in Japanese as Ichi, Ni, San. So we talk about Issei, Nisei, which is me, a second generation, then Sansei, and we now have Goseis and so forth. But the Issei's in camp are the ones that were really hurt, because they had come to this country years ago, had worked very hard to get wherever they were, be it in farming, running a store or whatever, and then all of a sudden the war came and they just lost everything. Their English proficiency was not that great still. They just lost everything. In the case of my dad, for example, he was in a separate place along with some of his colleagues. And so they just kind of faded away in camp. The Niseis, my generation, the older group, were now in their early 20s, mid-20s. They started taking over the leadership roles. So the Issei fathers, for example, who were used to being in charge of everything at home and what have you, they had nothing to do. They didn't have any interaction with the administration and so forth. So they're the ones that really, really suffered over time because of the fact that they were just displaced by their offspring. Out of that whole mess is another very interesting story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was initially made up of volunteers from Hawaii. As I mentioned, the Hawaiian Japanese were not interned, and as a result of that, they were ready to go and fight the war and all that stuff. So there were about 9,000 volunteers from Hawaii that initially joined the Army. They formed what they called the 100th Battalion, and they were sent to Europe, and they performed very, very well. And so the Army decided, hey, these guys are pretty good, let's go back and get some more from the camps. Well, the reception in the camps wasn't quite as cordial, in the sense that there was someone said, "You kidding me? You put me in this camp and now you want me to join the Army?" But there were many who did. My brother was one of them. His reasoning was that it would help my dad somehow. There were a lot of reasons why they did that. Some were just pure loyalty to the U.S., but others were just more personal things. So anyway, the Hawaiian 100th Battalion and the volunteers from the mainland, from the camps, got together. They formed this 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And they were sent as a unit to France and Italy and Germany. And they really performed very, very well. In fact, they became the most decorated unit in the history of the U.S. Army to this day. Well, it's still the case. They ended up with like 21 Medals of Honor and just on and on and on. The thing they were best known for was the rescue of what they called the Lost Battalion. This was a battalion of soldiers from Texas who were surrounded by the Germans, and they were just being annihilated. They had sent in a couple of their own fellow battalions, but they just could not make it through. So they finally ordered the 442nd that had just got back to a rest area because of some previous battles they were in, but they were called up to try to go to rescue this lost battalion. Well, they did do it after some tremendous battles that went on, and they rescued 211 of the Texans. You know, there's usually a battalion of 800 or more. But in doing so, 184 of their own troops, the 442nd, were killed. And then there were an additional 600 or so who were wounded. So that hit the headlines in the United States, and it got a lot of publicity. And it really did help to start changing the attitude of the American public toward Japanese Americans in general. So they were a very, very important part of Japanese American history. My brother was wounded. In fact, he was wounded about a week before that lost battalion battle that I mentioned, and he figures that had he not been in the hospital, he would have probably not survived that battle. There was another group of Japanese Americans who spoke Japanese or read Japanese quite well for whatever reason. Their parents might have sent them to Japan for a couple of years or whatever it was. So they formed what they called the Military Intelligence Service, MIS. And there were about 4,000 of them that served in the Pacific. And they would serve as interpreters and translators, interrogators, and so forth. But that whole thing that they did was classified. They couldn't talk about it until 1972. You know, well after the Second World War, for some reason, the government, the Army decided that it was classified information. So they weren't allowed to talk about it. But they were credited with shortening the war and saving many lives in the Pacific. They even served to help during the surrender period and even into the occupation of Japan. They were very instrumental in kind of smoothing the way between the American, the American military and the Japanese military and government. And finally, toward the end of the war, as I mentioned, within a year after the camps were started, as I say, the government must have realized that this thing was costing us money. We got guys on guard duty at these places. After a while, there weren't even any fences. And where were they going to go? In the middle of the desert and what have you, even if they wanted to escape. And so they started to encourage the younger people to leave camp, to either go in the Army, like I mentioned, or to go to school or get a job or whatever. So toward the end, there were a lot of young people that were already gone. But then all of a sudden now, the government said, here's $25, you can go home now. And of course, for a lot of people, that period was as traumatic as being in camp. Because all of a sudden now, you have no job, you have no home, and they're telling you to go home someplace. And so it was a very trying time period for Japanese Americans in general. And because of the knowledge that came out of that report that I mentioned 40 years later, all that started to surface. And as people, President Carter initiated a panel of distinguished people to go around the country and kind of interview people and find out how is it that the U.S. imprisoned its own citizens during the time of wars was really what he was after. And as a result of the investigations, which I'll get to a little bit, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, and then President Bush, the senior President Bush, sent out a letter of apology in 1990. And this is a copy of that letter that everybody got, including me. And the key part of it is what it says here. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize the serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. So, what did we learn from all this now as a country and as a people? Well, first of all, it's very, very clear from just on and on and on, the investigations went on, that the internment was just not constitutional. It should have been apparent to any lawyer at that point. In fact, there was one Japanese-American lawyer, a guy named Yasutake, who challenged the internment on the basis of the fact that it was not constitutional. Well, he didn't win, and he spent time in prison and so forth because of that. And there was never any case of sabotage or espionage or anything else. And so what that panel that President Carter put together learned, basically, what they said was that the internment was based on hysteria, just plain old war hysteria. It was based on racism. Because after all, we were at war with a couple of other countries besides Japan, right? Germany and Italy, and they were not incarcerated. Can you imagine having put Joe DiMaggio in a camp? There would have been a riot. Because he was a second generation, Italian American, just like me, as a Japanese American. So it was clearly based on racism. And then what they call lack of political leadership. They said there wasn't anybody of substance in the government who was willing to stand up and say, wait a minute, this whole thing just doesn't make any sense, it's not constitutional. There was just not anybody that would come up with that. So it was on that basis that this Civil Liberties Act was pushed through. And that enabled, the thing that enabled the U.S. government to apologize officially for the acts that occurred. So the thing to be learned, I think, is that we've got to make sure that we never do anything like that to another group of people in this country. Because history has shown that racism and fear and all kinds and that kind of thing can lead to all kinds of unfortunate things, and our history books are just full of it. The Yellow Peril, the whole civil rights thing. And remember the Oklahoma bombings when the federal government and they shut down airports and whatever, and it turned out to be an American kid that did that. And so with 9/11 and all the subsequent things that have occurred now, there's a lot of finger pointing now at other kinds of people, and I think we've got to learn from the mistakes of the past and just make sure we don't ever do that kind of thing again. And with that, I thank you for your attention. So now, if you have any questions, yes.
Why were the Hawaiians not interned?
Well, that's a long story, but the short part of it, the short version of it is that there was a lot of support among the other ethnic groups in the community, and then they had a general, can't think of his name now, who was a counterpart to General DeWitt. And he'd been out there and kind of understood and had been working with the people out there. And when he heard that the government was thinking about interning the Hawaiian Japanese Americans, he wrote back to them and said, you can't do that, because if you do, the whole economy of Hawaii is going to shut down. There were just too many Japanese Americans in all kinds of places, in the government, in the military, or what have you. And they said, you pull those people out and the whole economy of Hawaii is going to shut down. So that really is a short answer to that question. Yes.
Sorry, it was General Emmons.
Right, thank you. General Emmons, that's right.
Well, but there was that small camp, remember, that was in the Gold Pineapple, in the gully?
What's that?
We've since learned that there was research that was done, that in fact, if you want to call them sacrificial lambs, there were some people that were identified supposedly as leaders so that they could have something to say that, there were some people that were being investigated or whatever that might be problems.
Well, there was a very small group that was interned in Hawaii. It's not like not a single person. But people in my father's category, for example, there were a few that were put in a camp in Hawaii. Yes?
Well, actually, our grandfather, who was in Hawaii at the time, was a community leader, and he was thrown in jail in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And separated from the family. And separated from the family, so the rest of the family, they had to take a ship across over to the mainland, and they were thrown in Jerome, Arkansas. So,
Yeah.
they had to travel all the way from Hawaii to Arkansas.
Wow.
What kind of communication did you have with your father in the other camp, and were letters censored or?
Well, at the beginning, we had some, I told you he was upstairs
Right. Yeah.
above his office, and so his colleagues would get us to go see him and so
Okay.
forth. So, but then that was not, the bad side of that was that the other prisoners started to think that he was a spy for the US government, because he seemed to be getting, and he did get special treatment,
Right.
you know, because of his situation. So, yeah. Yes.
I had a Japanese roommate back in college, and we were eating dinner one night ages ago, and she told me that some of the Japanese families who were interned had their land taken away, and it was given to the Salvation Army. I was wondering if that was ever verified, if there was any truth to that at all.
There was a lot of things like that
Yeah.
were going on, but frankly, I don't know that much about that. Does anybody know anything about that? Yeah, there were a lot of things like that that did come up.
At the time, she said it never got turned back to the families. It may still be owned by them. This is what really happened.
Yeah. I'm sure that's the case, you know.
Yeah, I believe her.
Joe?
Seeing as so many came from the West Coast, what were the winters like? And some, I mean, I'm looking at some of these states and where they're located, I can't, and the lack of insulation in
Yeah.
the barracks, I can't imagine what the winter must have been.
The number one, people in California that went to Wyoming, for example, you know, they don't have fur coats and big heavy stuff, so it was very bad for them. Aside from that, just because the construction was so fast, and they were using wood that was not even dry yet, because they were in such a hurry to build these things. So when the wood dried, there were great big gaps between the planks, and so I can remember my mother, she was a fastidious housekeeper, and it used to drive her crazy because within 10 minutes after she wiped everything down, everything was all dusty again, because of the cracks in the walls and on the floor and so forth. And also it made it cold. It made it very, very, the only source of heat was a potbelly stove that was in the middle of the room. And so you got your own coal and, or whatever, and wood, and use that to keep warm. Yes?
As a chef in your mess hall, who cooked for you, and were you allowed to eat your ethnic foods?
Were you allowed to, well, at the beginning, no. There wasn't any. It wasn't that you weren't allowed to, it just there wasn't any. But later on, they started to try to accommodate, you know, like rice and things of that sort. They would, and then some root kinds of foods that people, Japanese eat. They tried to bring those kind of things in.
Just to add on to the answer, my Issei grandmother lost a lot of weight because it was mac and cheese. We were in Poston, and Issei people are not used to having that kind of dairy, and it wasn't until we had more meat and vegetables that she started to
I
regain.
work at a Japanese restaurant, so I was very curious.
To this day, my 90-year-old mother won't eat sauerkraut. She
Yeah.
eats sauerkraut every day.
Oh.
That's why I don't like salad. Yes.
So, just to get it turned into a better note, how did you and your family assimilate into, you know, a better life after you left camp?
Well, we were pretty lucky because my father, he was hired, when he came out of camp, the only job they could get was as a butler and a cook, my mother and I. So we lived in a very rich family home where, you know, they were the butler and the cook. We lived in the servants' quarters and so forth. But within a couple of years, he was recruited to be the executive director of what they called the Chicago Resettlers Committee, which was a group that they formed through the government to help. They had an office to help people coming out of camp to resettle with jobs and finding a place to live and things like that. So he got that kind of a job, and so very quickly we were out of the oh my God, what are we going to do kind of situation like a lot of other people were in. And then actually my oldest brother and sister finished college, and my sister went and got a graduate degree at the University of Chicago. In fact, I think about it, three of us in the family, the three boys in the family, my two brothers and I, all have doctorates. And then my sister, who's the smartest one in the family, did not go that far. She got a master's degree and quit. But we were very lucky in just the way things progressed for us.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to recount a little situation I've been through. For years I've had a wonderful neighbor named Sam Shimoda. And he has told me about his recollections of being taken from his home in San Jose and going to a camp. Actually, he didn't make it to the camp. He was put on a train after a 1-week stay at Tan Foran, where he lived in a horse stall. He was 17 years old. When the train got to Sandy, Utah, they asked if anybody knew how to farm. Sam came from a farming family who got off the train and said, I know how to farm. And they said, good luck. He was the only one. They dumped him off and said, go raise some fruit. He went up into the dry hills above Sandy, and this is Mormon country, and he was Japanese. And he said the Mormon farmers treated him so wonderfully. And anytime he needed a piece of equipment, take it. How long can I keep it? As long as you need it. Do you need some seed? Yes. Here it is. And he spent the war in Sandy, Utah, raising wheat on the hillsides of Sandy, Utah.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah, and now you bring up the Mormons and so forth, I should mention that there was one group who really helped the Japanese Americans during the war, and that was the Quakers. From the very beginning, bringing food to the people who were trying to get ready to go to camp, to bring food to the trains, helping people. In fact, they're the ones who helped my brother and sister go off to college when they left camp, because they would try to find. They helped them fill out application forms, send them into the schools, and all that kind of. I mean, they were a fantastic help. They were the only real organized, large, organization that really put themselves out to help the Japanese.
Joe, my father was a grocer in Campbell during the internment, and he bought strawberries from a family called Nishimura, and they were a wonderful, really good family. And they had several boys that they sent back to Japan to go to military school for 1 year and then come back here. And so I asked my dad, I said, Dad, why are they doing this to these poor people? And he said, well, son, they can't figure out who is a spy and who isn't. So they're gonna put them all away. And that was his answer. And I said, well, what gives them the information to believe that that might be true? And he said, well, there's an outfit called the Purple Dragons. I don't know if you ever heard of them. And those people are loyal to Japan and blah, blah, blah. So I kind of took it from there, but I want to tell you that I've been very impressed with your treatment of how you were treated and what the internment process did to you and your family. I think, I don't know how I would have stood it. It was really wonderful.
Well said.
Thank you.
Joe, if I might, I have a short vignette just to share with you. I was a class of 43 at San Jose High, and a young gentleman slightly older than I, class of 42, was Ikara Iwasaki. That's the picture that appeared in our yearbook. And Carl, of course, was interned rather soon. And a little vignette here. We were downtown one time before he left, and he said, "Bob, could I borrow your knife?" And I said, "Well, Carl, where's yours?" He said, "Bob, I'm not supposed to carry one." Imagine that. So he and his family went to Wyoming, as you mentioned, Joe. And I got a couple of pictures from him. And Joe mentioned it was kind of cold back there, and there's Carl with the snow stuff on it, a little hat on his head and everything. And he sent me that, and it says, "I hope to see you soon, Bob, Hikara." And then he, as Joe mentioned, they encourage people before long to do something, because especially young people. And Carl, being a photographer, they realized that, gee, he might know how to develop X-ray film, you know? So they sent him into the hospital area that you alluded to, and he was working in the X-ray lab and whatnot at Heart Mountain. And then after again, they realized that he had a lot more to offer, and they sent him to Colorado. And he was stationed out of Denver in Colorado, and then in my going into the Air Corps, I ended up in Denver after basic training. Anyway, so we got together a few times for lunch at Edelweiss Restaurant. And I remember we were sitting there for lunch one day, and all of a sudden he looked at me and he said, of course I'm in uniform, he looked at me and said, "Bob, could you get in trouble by being seen with me?" But Carl was quite a guy, and I just had to share that little bit of one family that I didn't know his family, but I just knew Carl. The interesting thing was that being stationed out of Colorado, he was sent to, from time to time to the East Coast to document the returning, he told me, Nisei troops. Does that sound right? Nisei troops.
That's
coming from Europe. And he documented their homecomings and all that.
I see.
And then later on, Carl's hooked up there in Denver, and later on became a donating or a stringer for Life magazine, and he carried captions in Life magazine for quite a few years of things that happened around in the Colorado area. But there was just one person that had an interesting life to describe.
Did you have to be a citizen to serve in the military, or could you be a first-generation Japanese to serve?
I think you had to be a citizen. I've never been asked it. But I do think you had to be a citizen.
Joe, how did you get supplies?
Pardon me?
How long were you in the camp?
I was in camp for 2 years, but there were other people who were in for 4 or 5 years. And I think, again, because of the help that my dad got from his former colleagues, we got, under the Freedom of Information Act, we got all the information that the government had on my dad. And there's testimonies in there that really impressed me, because they were from his colleagues, as well as his boss and his boss's boss, where they wrote letters of support for my dad. And then there were transcripts of hearings that they had too. And so they really did support him very, very strongly. And I think it's because of that that we were able to get out of camp earlier. We got out in 1944, well before the war was over. And then the initial place I ended up was in, that we went to was Cincinnati, because as I mentioned, my brother and sister were there. And so when I first, and it was a very rich suburb of Cincinnati. They had never seen a non-white person before. And I walked into the class, and the principal, I remember, introduced me to the class. And I was a real novelty. Quite a lot. Yes?
Do you think what's the legacy now from that time? Is there still a ripple effect, or do you think that,
What kind of legacy?
Legacy, yeah, from the...
Never let it happen again.
Yeah, but I mean, how do people within, say, the Japanese American community feel now? The younger generations especially.
Well, yeah, that's again a hard question to try to answer, because there's just all kinds of feelings about it. But in general, there's a Japanese saying called shikata ga nai, and what it means is, well, it's the way it goes. It can't be helped, kind of feeling. And I think in many Japanese families, my mother used to tell me that all the time when something happened I thought was very unjust. And she'd say, well, shikata ga nai. So I think it's that kind of feeling that people had about, in general, about that experience. Yeah, Aggie?
Thank you. I think my uncle helped me understand. I'm third generation, and Uncle George explained to me that when I said, why did you just go so quietly? In our generation, we're learning to question and challenge. And he said, well, Chicha, that's my Japanese nickname. In Japan, when the emperor says, this is the way it is, you bow and you obey quietly and you go ahead and do it. You don't question authority in Japanese culture. In America, the president says, this is the way it is. So they quietly went. They did not want to question authority. It just made sense to me in terms of the mentality of the whole thing.
Well, it's 7 o'clock.
Unless there's any more questions, you're welcome to tour the house. I think our food is all gone, but thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We've got flyers for our next events.
Well, yeah, that's like my dad. In North Dakota, I was 8 years old, 9 years old. And I couldn't believe I see you.
Thank you. I'll get there. Proud of you.
Wait a second. I'm in line.